You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast, and on this episode, we're putting together our comic book mixtape. Here we go. Welcome to the Fan2Fan Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Bernie Gonzalez, along with fellow co-host Pete Charbonneau. And in this episode, we're talking about comic books. A few episodes ago, we had amazing frequent guests, Michele, Brittany, and Joshua Pruett. We all shared our respective comic book origin stories, how we got into comic books, our first comics, and we wanted to continue that conversation by making some recommendations, some suggestions, comics, manga, graphic novels that have influenced us, that have touched us because of the writing, of the artwork, the story, whether you're into DC, Marvel, independents, heroes, non-superheroes, doesn't matter. They're all amazing. They're all comics. So we're going to share some of our faves. So a little bit about Michele, Brittany. Michele, one L in Michele, two T's in Brittany. She's a writer, an editor, a photographer, and a pop culture scholar. Her interests lie in the worlds of horror, spy, and gothic genres. She's edited a few essay collections, including the Bram Stoker Award-nominated Horror in Space, and you can find Michele's blog and more info about her work at her website, michelebritney.com, along with partner Nick Dyack, who's also a frequent guest on the Fan2Fan Podcast. They co-host the HP Lovecast podcast, dedicated to the works inspired by, you guessed it, H.P. Lovecraft. All right, a little bit about Josh Pruett. Josh is at Zombie TARDIS on Instagram and Twitter, and if you can't tell by the name, the man is a fan of genre. He's also a Primetime Emmy-winning writer, author, and storyboard artist. He's worked on Mystery Science Theater, Phineas and Ferb, Last Kids on Earth, Doctor Who, co-writer of the middle-grade novel Shipwreckers, The Curse of the Cursed Temple of Curses, or We Nearly Died a Lot. I love that title. Josh is awesome, and let's get into it. Let's talk comics. One of the things that I wanted to do in this discussion is give some recommendations, because I think this is, again, no different than discovering a director or a band that you love and you want everyone else to watch the same movie or download the album, right? Please check it out so we can talk about it. Because
here's this mixtape I'm going to give you.
Yes,
it's a mixtape. It's a mixtape. It's a comic book mixtape.
And let's not short shrift comics, and let's treat them the same way, because we have different entry points, different ways where we've discovered comics and continue to kind of dig into the world of comics. I think that'll be a good reflection of the things we love and the things we like. Mm-hmm. So, but please, Michele, share some recommendations that, honorable mentions. There's no real like top three format like we've done in other episodes, just stuff that you love and, maybe why you love it.
Sure. Well, I mentioned earlier 30 Days of Night, co-created by Steve Niles and Ben Temple-Smith. And I did go back and look to see when they originated. And so that was from 2002. Mm-hmm. So that was already out by the time I had read it. But I thought it was such a fantastic story. Vampires, love vampire stories. And this was just, it seemed like it could be realistic because it's set in Barrow, Alaska, where for 30 days, it's just perpetual night. And wouldn't that just be a heaven for a vampire that they could, kind of plow through a city or, a small town without the worry of sunlight? How do you survive when you've got such an astounding predator in your midst? Such a wonderful story. And again, it was probably one of the first ones that I read that got really into horror. Another one that I really liked was Mouse Guard.
Mice struggle to live safely and prosper among all of the world's harsh conditions and predators. The Mouse Guard, a selfless group of cloaked mice, keep the common mouse safe from predators, weather, and the wilderness. They patrol the mouse territories to allow mouse civilization not just to survive, but thrive. It matters not what you fight, but what you fight for.
Mouse Guard was created by David Peterson, and it came out in 2006. So I think this was another one of those that was absolutely brand new. Nobody knew David Peterson,
right?
And I have first runs of all of his comics. But it was a medieval, world where the story characters are mice, and they deal with, all the important, huge themes of brotherhood and chivalry and war and love, survival, but in mice form.
They were smaller, right?
Yeah, I think they were like 8x8 square.
Yeah.
They were little square comics.
Yep.
So they were very unusual and not as I recall, I was like one of the few that was reading them, and it took a little bit of time. This is a guy, his art is just stunning. Absolutely
It's
stunning.
beautiful stuff.
Beautiful work, and really falls into what we've been talking about, where art really does bring you in. It's that visual, and his artwork is just phenomenal. Another one that I've liked over the years, Judge Dredd. Because kind of getting into some of that foreign stuff that I've read over the years. I have been a long time follower. It actually started back in 1977. It is a British comic, and it is still running. But that was co-created by John Wagner, who was big in British comics, and of course Carlo Escavera, who really brought to life Judge Dredd.
There were a lot of Vertigo creators that came out of doing 2000 AD, doing Judge Dredd stories and other things in that era. A lot of British creators. Yeah,
and a lot of them came over, and did a lot of other work. Trying to think of some of the other stuff that Carlos did. I had the pleasure of actually meeting him and covering some of his panels, because I did comics journalism, so I was out covering panels, and I actually got to meet him and chat with him, and it was really neat for me.
So cool.
Kind of shifting gears into space horror, I would say Caliban by Garth Ennis, and the artwork is by Facundo Patricio. I'm sorry, I'm not really good with foreign language, but that came out in 2014, and that was in response to the Prometheus movie. So it's kind of interesting how comics influence films. Well, films influenced a comic. And this was Ennis's kind of take. He saw the film and thought, I'd take it in a different direction. I highly recommend. It's a real good mix of Event Horizon and several other space horror films, with a twist of, more of a strong female type, kind of in keeping with Ripley. It's a pretty good one. And Bernie Wrightson, just legendary, right up there with your Frank Miller and Jack Kirby and others. Just an incredible artist. He worked with Creepy. He worked with developing these beautiful illustrations for Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Co-created Swamp Thing, which I still haven't read, but I actually want to read what he did. The artwork that he did, and I think he partnered with Alan Moore on that one.
It was Len Wein first. Len Wein first.
So I would say anything Bernie Wrightson, definitely check out, particularly if you're an artist that's looking to really kind of develop a style and kind of has an affinity towards the classics. And I'm talking like, late 1800s, early 1900s, really going back. You couldn't learn from a better teacher with all
amazing
all
guy.
Yeah.
His work was super rigorous, but I think he's like one of those perfect dictionary examples of the concept that before you can learn to exaggerate the human form, you have to learn to draw the human form. Right. And he was able to do that. He was able to then take monsters like Swamp Thing or Frankenstein and bring life into them, because he knew the core of figure drawing. Wrightson was a master at being able to do that. I mean, it's same with like people like Frazetta, where, you can almost get caught up with the glossiness, the shininess, but it's rooted in fundamentals, in having. Go ahead. Oh no, just but being just like good, solid artists.
Yeah, he's extraordinary and huge influence on me too. And when I was in college, one of our professors was friendly with Bernie and had him come in. He talked about blowing his eyes out, doing the Frankenstein things. Like he messed himself up pretty much for the rest of his life. But he also shared how when he was a younger artist, like he was so enamored with Frazetta, and he was like, I can never be like that. I can never do that. But one of the things he realized, he was like, but Frazetta doesn't do horror very much. He's usually in this fantasy place. What if I'm like the Frazetta in spooky stuff. And so he was able to kind of take the things about Frazetta that he liked and then synthesize it in his own style in a genre that Frazetta didn't, quote unquote, specialize in. There's some great creepy Frazetta covers. But it's interesting you bring him up because there is a connection there. I mean, certainly Bernie influenced so many artists.
All those roots are there, right? Like Frazetta is so synonymous with every pulp cover that I can remember. Like
that's it.
Every book that I checked out in the library growing up, I don't know who John Carter of Mars is, but the cover makes me want to pick it up. And then you get lost in the story. But then the fact that all of these characters that we know, like Batman and Superman, are such a byproduct of the pulp era, like characters like the Phantom in the Shadow, they've just certainly evolved with times, with culture, with society. It's people like Wrightson and Frazetta, Kirby, that were products of their time. When you see pictures of Jack Kirby's grandkids talking about how Jack Kirby's drawing room was surrounded by paperbacks and pulp novels. And you can almost just imagine him being a World War II vet, early 50s America, suburban boom, right? All of these things that are just changing the world around you. And then you've got these pulp novels about visiting Mars and sci-fi and worlds that are completely unconventional and unrealistic, but things are starting to become a little bit more realistic around you. And then some of these artists that we love were able to then kind of take a little bit of that, sample the real world with what they had in their head and then put it on the page. So Josh,
they synthesize it, right? They synthesize their life experience, the things they love, into their own stories, right?
Yep.
I think that's how that works.
Remember, you can find the Fan2Fan podcast at www.fanpodcast.com. Facebook, just search Fan2Fan Podcast. That's FAN, the number 2, FAN.
On Instagram at Fan2Fan Podcast.
Or on Twitter at Fan2Fan Podcast.
We'd love to hear from you, so send a message and let us know what you think of the show. Thanks.
And now, on with the show.
3 more, because I just want to represent some of the foreign, another area of foreign, and that would be in Japan. Artists that are on par with Frank Frazetta, and Bernie Wrightson, and that would be Gou Tanabe, who has gone through and has adapted some of the H.P. Lovecraft stories, Call of Cthulhu and At the Mountains of Madness. And his art is just phenomenal. I had the opportunity to review his work, and usually I wouldn't like an electronic copy, but I had an electronic copy of his work, and being able to actually blow it up and look at just his line work and his shading was just awesome.
Yeah.
And very much in keeping with our Western artists, that the names that we're more familiar with. So I would encourage listeners to check out Gou Tanabe. His work is published through Dark Horse Manga Line. The other one is Junji Ito. He has done a lot of horror manga, particularly Tomie, which is an immortal girl who drives admirers just absolutely, into madness and, death and things like that. He is a writer, he's an artist. And so he does all of his own work. And he's just, from what I can tell from his interviews, he's a pretty unassuming individual. And yet he has...
Who loves cats?
Who
does books about his cats?
How I got into him.
He loves cats,
Cat Diary.
Yeah.
And then the last one is a really oddball, but it's called Wolf's Mound. And it's done by Mitsushi Yuji. And it's a series that ran from 2009 to 2016. It was published by Vertical. And I have a real passion for history, particularly European history. And so he wrote and illustrated a historical story set in the 1300s and centered on a particular mountain pass that was ruled by a very brutal, fanatical individual. Probably one of the most brutal series that I have ever read, but also just so immersing of your wanting to read through every single one. Absolute phenomenal story. So I would say, in that particular case, it was the story that really drew me in more than the art. Cover, again, like we've been talking about how covers can draw you in. And I think the cover of Bailiff, who is just has this really intimidating stare out at the audience. It just kind of drew me in. And so anyway, those are some of my selections.
It's an interesting too, like combination of like the artistry and the industry, because you mentioned like how the cover of Fell got you interested enough to check it out, but the fact that like, you know, we're kind of used to the rigorous pace of like the monthly comic, and in manga they even have a more rigorous deadline and pacing because they release so much so quickly. But some of the artists that you mentioned, at least, you know, in my awareness of them, especially like Junji Ito, you think of him, he can't produce that level of artwork with the demands of the manga market. But then they become almost like auteurs within the market that draw a lot of attention because of the rigorous levels of work. It just got me to think, because when you mentioned Junji Ito, I was thinking more for like Pete's benefit, like it's like a Cronenberg or Lynchian type world or artwork that he lives in. As I was going to say that, I'm like, man, it kind of sucks though that we can't use Junji Ito in the same way we can say Lynch or Cronenberg, and people kind of know what that means, because we don't know who Junji Ito is, or a lot of people don't know, but those that know, it's like, oh yeah, got it. There's like a little bit of body horror here, suspense. There's some Hitchcockian elements in here as well, where comics still has a longer road ahead of it to get folks to understand, like, yeah, here are some great artists and what they've done. You can use them interchangeably with terms like Spielbergian or Kubrick, because they also create a sense or a feeling that has its own sense and identity.
I liken that to the music industry, right? Like maybe you know, a generation or so behind, but like going to Tower Records and listening to imports there and discovering bands and artists and music from outside your normal sphere. Like it's available to you. I think it rewards, and it sounds like it certainly did for all of you, and Michele especially. It rewards your curiosity and wanting to discover, right? Like the more like you follow those threads and you pull on those threads, and you're now getting beyond just, you know, the very Americanized local industry, and then you get to experience and discover some just fantastic artistry from across the planet. And I think that's, you know, it's very similar. That's what I liken it to from my experience of discovering music from, you know, around the world, mostly for me in England, which is not that far removed from America. But it, you know, I think the principle of it holds true. Like it's about digging and trying to discover, and what artist or writer, you know, is on the end of that.
All right, Josh, share some of your recommendations.
Yeah, there's a couple like big things, and there's some modern stuff that I would just love to share. Like for folks who are interested in Walt Simonson, like I think he started issue 337 on his Fantastic Four run. His Thor run is amazing, but people usually talk about that because he's the guy who created like Frog Thor and Beta Ray Bill, which is one of my favorite characters of all time. But his FF run, I think, is just like pinnacle Fantastic Four, and I think Fantastic Four is tough to get right. There's a balance of keeping those four extraordinary characters as grounded and human and family-like, and then pulling out all the wonderful fantasy and universe mind-expanding stuff, the Galactus and Silver Surfer stuff. It's a hard balance to strike, but I think he does an extraordinary job, especially as a writer-artist. There's a story he does where Reed Richards fights Dr. Doom, and, you know, again, this is your superhero fare, right? Science, superhero, comic books. But he does this thing where they do a time travel battle. The way it's mapped out is the sides of every comic book page are Reed and Doom battling through time according to a digital clock, and you can follow their battle. What you don't notice until you've already read the comic is the cover is the moment when Reed gets the upper hand, because there is a digital readout on the bottom. Walt actually figured out how it all works. I think there's a Reddit about how he broke the story down. But it's just a great piece of storytelling. It's where a good guy fighting a bad guy, but he's approaching it in a way that only comics can do. And he's turning it back into art. There's a craft to this, right? And we are talking about pop culture artifacts. That's what this is bits of entertainment. But he was able to then inject it with his own passion and thoughtfulness and, you know, created something kind of beautiful. His run on RoboCop versus Terminator, which sounds like easily dismissible licensed book, is extraordinary. Frank Miller writing, but I think it's the best work that Simonson has ever done. It's robots fighting robots, stuff that his artwork is, you know, he's super gifted at. There's also Dan Brereton's Nocturnals, which was big in the 90s, kind of came after that initial Image burst, fully painted in a noir kind of genre, and monsters who were kind of in a dark cops and robbers film noir universe. It's amazing. That's something that I go back to kind of all the time. And, some of it's comfort food, and then some of it, right, is like inspiration. So it's like these kind of seminal, informative things. And then modern stuff that's kind of fun that I wanted to throw out to folks, and things that I've read with my kids, actually. So speaking with manga, so one I really love is called Hat Atelier by Tomie Shirahama. The illustrations in this series are gorgeous. And it's interesting, Michele, because you were talking about Bernie's influences, and right, that kind of Dore pen and ink quality, right? Mm-hmm. And like this has some of that, and it's a super adorable story, and it's for all ages. And then the other one that I've been enjoying recently, and I've been reading with my eldest, Katie, is a book called Delicious in Dungeon. And it's like the greatest setup ever. This is by Rocketo. So this is adventurers in a Dungeons and Dragons universe, and the way the dungeon works is like there's multiple entrances, but you get in the dungeon, and the dungeon is huge. It's huge and cursed, so it's almost like it never ends. So there's many levels, and you will run into other adventurers throughout, right? And they're all in different parts of the dungeon and different levels of the dungeon. But at some point, they are in a desperate situation. And they can either give up on one of their kind of fellowship mates and head back, or someone comes with a brilliant idea that they're going to eat the monsters that live in the dungeon. And there's a dwarf character who knows how to do this, but it's kind of frowned upon. And so you have this adorable kind of structure where they go on this adventure, and then they cook the thing that they fought, or the thing that almost ate them. They end up cooking it. But, oh, man, it's fun stuff.
It's funny you mentioned that because, like, I think, what is it? Vox Machina, Critical Role, Die. They've all been, like, modern interpretations of, like, the Dungeons and Dragons, like, tropes that we kind of know. Yeah, like, I've never played a Dungeons and Dragons IP. We've kind of talked about that. Like, we're kind of in the crowd that you think would have had a friend, a cousin, or someone that would have introduced us and said, hey, I'll be the dungeon master. You think of a character, and we would have probably enjoyed that. But there's been some really interesting modern interpretations of that mythos of that world that have played around with it. And the one you mentioned, Josh, is just like, oh, here's another version of it that probably plays on the stuff that we all kind of know, but you don't really have to have played one roll dice of Dungeons and Dragons to understand.
And I'm super glad you said that, because that is not my wheelhouse. I know lots of fun things about different worlds, and that's not one that I'm the most read up on. And I love it because it has that wonderful high concept and great characters.
And I mentioned that because you mentioned you were reading it with one of your kids. And then I think about, again, like kind of going back to, we have the benefit of like the internet where you can find things and read things. Google something and find out if you're going to like it. You can preview it. You can see what other people say about it. You could have people on Reddit, like you're mentioning, Josh, dissecting what it means and what it could mean. It can be kind of weighty if the story is just not good. Like you can play on all the tropes, and you can be like, hey, you kind of know what this is about, right? Yeah, we all kind of know about dungeons and kind of what that world looks like. But you still have to tell a good story, and your daughter still has to enjoy it for it to work.
Yeah, for sure. And I think this is one of the things that I think is so special about comics, and why we could probably do 10 podcasts about this, is that like I think comics are a perfect medium because they can do everything. So they are only limited by the abilities of the creators. So someone could spend the rest of their lives doing Xerox copy stapled comics of their own story forever if they're up for it. And like you can draw anything. You can draw any genre. They've, slice of life stuff, comics like Clerks, where it's your life. There's tons of that stuff in zines and the indie scene. Like there's so much flexibility in comics. And I think that we're in a real renaissance of that because we've got graphic novels coming from large publishers. We've got mini comics are still out there, people doing mini comic conventions that are really about chapbooks that people are folding and stapling. But I think that's what's super special about comics, is that you can just go and make them if you can make them. If you barely know how to draw, that's fine. But if your jokes are good, like, you're set. Comics are kind of endlessly malleable. And I think that's what makes them special.
100% agree. The jokes don't even have to be that good. It's the best part.
I don't write good
to
jokes.
recognize them as being jokes.
Yeah. That's the bar, Pete. That's the very high bar.
So if you guys will indulge me, I'll share a few recommendations
Please.
that I wanted to throw out there. They'll come with the caveat that I think whenever I've recommended comics, because again, it's very different than recommending a movie or an album, I always tried to consider the entry point, because that's always been an issue with comics, right? Like evergreen versions of characters that are outside of continuity, the crossovers, animated versions, movie versions of characters that we've seen. And whenever someone's like, hey, my kid wants to check out comics, you know about comics, can you share something? Then I always try to give them the kind of like concentrated version of a character that is probably going to be more of a touch point for them. And in that case, like the Batman and Superman animated series that were out there, Batman Adventures, Superman Adventures, those are just like, if we all grew up with Batman 66 and that kind of defined the language of superheroes for us, that we know, if a kid is going to pick up a comic, I don't know that I would want them picking up something that's like in the deep end of like the continuity pool, where you have to know so much because it's so dense that it's inaccessible. But I think those comics do a good job of like, here's what Batman is and here's Superman, without having to read other books or other iterations of it. In the same vein, New Frontier by Darwyn Cooke, he was a big influence on me artistically. He tapped into like the Fleischer cartoons, certainly the animated series, because he worked with them. The series is just like a good introduction to the origins of Superman, Batman, Green Lantern, Wonder Woman, Flash, Manhunter. And you get like that good transition from that pulp golden age into the silver age. Like he does a good job of being the bridge of like old comics to the modern world of comics. This is the world that we grew up with. He does a good job of giving you like the concentrated version. This is all you need to know if this is all you ever knew about these characters, and it's more than enough.
It's like that evergreen thing. Like this is 100%. The ultimate version of these characters. Yeah.
Yes. And beyond that, the other two that I'll put out there for mature storytelling, because there's stuff like Cerebus, Watchmen, Concrete, Blankets, Craig Thompson, like really good, mature day-to-day stuff that has nothing to do with capes, but that also, still tackles interesting stories. But in the world of comics for me, it was always Daredevil, Man Without Fear. And it was the first comic that I can remember that I had an emotional reaction to, because it's Daredevil. It's a hero, right? It's this blind hero. We all know it from the movies now, but it's really about like that series by Frank Miller with John Romita Jr. It's about a father-son relationship. That's really what it's about. Like living in the shadow of your father, getting out of that shadow, kind of building your own legacy, looking back at your father and realizing that maybe it's not what you remembered. And I think it was just a really well-told story that if you've never read a Daredevil story before, here's just a story about a father and a son, what their world looks like as they are anchor points to each other and the choices they make. So then last but not least, just because it's just damn good artwork, and that's literally what I have in my notes, just plain damn good artwork, is anything by Guy Davis. And I'll specifically throw out the Marquee, because in that world of Hellboy and Dark Horse comics of like the 90s into the early aughts, he carved a space for himself. Guy Davis did, where he worked with, was it Sandman, like Mystery Theater or something in DC and like Vertigo. But he tells such a good story of like Dante's Inferno and the Spanish Inquisition. It looks so cool, which makes sense because then he goes on to work with Guillermo del Toro on, I think, every production, because Guillermo del Toro is like, I loved your work and I need to steal you to do concept artwork for me.
And working on BPRD, the comic, and like doing
Pacific
monster
Rim
designs for Pacific Rim,
Shape
and
of Water, all the above.
The guy is amazing.
Yes, that's if anything, that's the only place where it kind of hurts us, is that I'm sure in the world of Hollywood, Guy Davis was rewarded, as he should be, better than making comics. But I would always take a Guy Davis comic any day.
Any day of the week.
In lieu of new ones, I would say The Marquis, if you want to see something that's a little macabre, just a little off-center, not capes. Some recommendations that folks may enjoy.
Pete, do you have any that you think people should check out?
I'll mention one, and I talked about it at the start, but I found it to be like a fascinating relic of its time, and that's the Tomb of Dracula series that was, like the early to mid 70s. I think it ran about 7 years. Written by Marv Wolfman. I mean, the guy Wolfman was the writer for the.
Come on, and it's like Gene Colan, I think, is the artist, right?
Gene Colan did the pencils. Tom Palmer on the inks. Tom Palmer worked on Star Wars for many years. From what I can gather, just like it in the pocket, just like solid.
Oh man, for real!
Like just great work across the board. Yeah, what I liked about Tomb of Dracula, there's a lot of dated parts to it because it is mid 70s, but they took something that I was curious when I started reading it, like where are they going to go with this character? And he really is very much like an anti-hero throughout the run. There's a template there for kind of what you see in modern like MCU stuff, where there's like a group headed by Rachel Van Helsing. So again, like elevating a kind of a badass female character to kind of lead this group with, there's names I want to say like Quincy Harker so there's like character names from the original source material that are involved in this because it's the 70s. You've got satanic panic. So there are like satanic cults involved, and Dracula, you would think would be like, in sync with them, but not really. And there's like battles with that. It's like, trying to find a wife. He loses his powers at one point. I think they basically becomes like a human again at one point. So they throw in like a lot of interesting things that kind of elevates it from what could have been standard fare at the time. So,
and we get Blade in there, don't we? Like, isn't that the introduction of Blade?
Is introduced. Deacon Frost. So anyone familiar with the Wesley Snipes original, and I think a remake is on its way, or a reboot is on its way sometime soon. But so you get
less leather and more bell bottoms in that version.
Exactly.
Yeah, there is a little more bell bottoms. Yeah,
definitely a lot more. Yeah, there's definitely more afros. There's some like voodoo priests and things like that. So again, like there's parts of it that are a little cringy, but at the same time, I think a monument of its time. I found it very entertaining and certainly very interesting. It gets 70s weird, but I think in a good way. And before we wrap up this episode, I did have one more question I wanted to pose to the three of you, and this ties in a little bit with Josh, your book, which is out today, when the day that we're recording, of course, the last Comics on Earth. What your book is centered around is these characters kind of coming together to create characters because their favorite. There's a comic that they all love that is no longer going to be continuing. And I was curious because I had this happen to me when I was, reading the original Marvel Star Wars run, when it was announced that series was ending. And I was kind of like, what? How did comic books end?
Comics end?
Yeah, like, why are you ending this? And so I was just curious, like, if there was a favorite comic of yours that, was ended at some point, and how you reacted to it. Because again, like my brain was going back to like these legacy comics, Fantastic Four, The Incredible Hulk, that had been going for decades and decades, Superman going back to the 30s, Batman going back to the 30s and 40s. Like these things have just been like, they were just ubiquitous. And so they weren't ending. Like they may branch off into different, variations, but they didn't end. And to have Star Wars end that first time, it really was like kind of a blow to something that I really grown to love and enjoy. So I just, if you had any similar things happen to a favorite comic of yours, Josh.
I think I got lucky. I feel like I got lucky because we're coming up in an era where it was much more common for writer-artist teams or an artist to be on for a chunk of time and then move on. And so since my priority was and then miniseries. So like all the Hellboy stories were minis. Mm-hmm. So like when I was reading the more traditionally numbered stuff, it was like if my favorite team left, I might stick around for an issue or two, but usually not. Right. So it's like if I was reading X-Men and different people took over, I would check it out. But then it's like I would find myself just drawn to that team, so I would go follow that team. It's an interesting concept though, because these series they restart, they rebrand, they have a new title, they have a new this, they have a new. So there's always kind of new entry points. They're always trying to develop new entry points. Yeah, I would mourn kind of, I wish they would stay longer. Like that. That was usually my experience. Is like, oh man, he's only going to do 4 issues. Shoot, that was my experience with that. Michele, what about you?
The Witcher, written by Paul Tobin. I think he did like the first 3 story arcs. And I was really sad when I found out that he wasn't going to be writing them anymore, because his stories, because he had been playing the video game and he'd read the novels, he really had a great sense of the story and the universe. His stories resonated with me. I really felt like they were authentic in the Witcher universe. I think he left after the 3rd story arc. I was really, really sad because I did really enjoy his writing. Although others have come after him, I just really thought his stories were just absolutely wonderful for that series. So and I haven't really followed it much after that, after he left. So
Bernie, any for you?
This one's hard because we go from like things that we love to things that we've lost or potentially have lost, right? Like, man,
nothing ever ends because you can always go back and read it.
That's true. It's comics, right? They never end. I'm trying to think. There's one that is maybe a little sad, and I think it's Parker series that was released by IDW. But to be fair, I mean, it's because of the passing of Darwyn Cooke, and again, he was such a seminal influence for me. I remember when they announced that he was going to adapt the Richard Stark novels. I remember at the time I was commuting to work, and they're all like just like mystery pulp noir with a little bit of an edge to them. And if you've ever seen the movie, what is it, Point Blank, the John Borman movie with Lee Marvin, 1970 something, loose adaptation, but it kind of gives you the idea of the tone, the grit of those novels. And when Darwyn Cooke adapted them, I had to check out the books because I wanted to see what they were going to be about. And I think there's a Steve McQueen movie, The Hunter, I think, that's kind of also a loose adaptation of that. There's that movie with Mel Gibson, Payback. That was another loose version of it. He has seen a lot of different cinematic versions. The Parker series that was never fully realized because of Cooke's passing. That one allowed me to here's this kind of dense noir story, but now I can see the comic. This is cool. That's what I thought Darwyn Cooke did so well. On a lighter note, there's a Rocketo. And,
oh God, yeah.
Okay, so Josh, do you know what this is?
Yes.
Okay, written by Frank Espinoza. It was released by Speakeasy. And first thing that I'll tell you, if you end up ever Google searching it, the initial comic was released in it's a sideways comic.
Like a widescreen format. So that first blew my mind because, again, thinking about Fantastic Four comics, and you mentioned Walt Simonson, I remember there was a John Byrne Fantastic Four where the comic was done on its side. Yes, on the side, yeah.
Just like McFarlane did that with a Spider-Man issue. Yep. And it was just you're blowing my mind as a teenager. Wait, you can flip the comic and tell the story that way? What? That's not how the staples go. This is wrong. Yeah. But Rocketo was so interesting because the artist Espinoza, I believe he worked at Pixar. His artwork is just gorgeous to look at. There's certainly things that are cartoony about it. It's a bit unfinished. It's like gouache.
There's a rawness to it. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's imagine if you ever have picked up a making of a Pixar movie concept art book, it's that is the comic book. It's so fun because it's high adventure. You could tell he's having fun telling the mythology of this world. And I got lost in it. I loved it.
Yeah. Crazy world building. Beautiful.
So good. So good. And then it just stopped. But I'm glad it for the 2 collections that were released, which I think were about 8 issues or something like that. I'm glad that we got something because every once in a while when I go to a con, I see that it's out there. I will pick it up and give it to someone.
Yeah.
It just feels like this can't be hidden in a back issue box or in a storage unit till the next con. I got to buy it, give it to a friend, a family member, and be like, check this out. And if you don't like it, that's okay. Give it to someone else because it needs to find a home. It's so rare. It's such a unicorn.
Yeah. Track down Rocketo, gang.
So good.
So good. Treasure hunting. Yeah.
Yes.
There you go.
Comics can hurt you. On the next episode of the Fan2Fan Podcast.
There you go. All right. Well, that's how we end that one.